terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire and tone. These words are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set. Breaking the set.
Sorry about the audio difficulties, guys. Let's try this again. Amidst the many international political crises that have gripped the media attention over the last few years, perhaps one of the most overlooked and underreported mass injustices is the oppression of the Rohingya people of Myanmar. See, according to the UN, Rohingya Muslims are among the most persecuted minorities in the world. Although Muslims have lived in Myanmar since the 15th century, the country is predominantly Buddhist, with Rohingya Muslims making up only between 4 to 8% of the population. But ever since the 1962 military coup, the rights of the Rohingya people have slowly deteriorated. And for the last 50 years, they've been the target of an oppressive state campaign of isolation and oppression. All the while, the crisis incurs a total blackout from the Myanmar government and world media at large. Now, you probably wouldn't associate Buddhist monks with violence, but religious tensions between Rakhine Buddhists and Rohingya Muslims in recent years has escalated into a full-blown violent persecution of the latter. And since 2012, violent outbreaks have left hundreds dead and somewhere around 140,000 displaced. And on January 13th of this year, yet another massacre occurred in the township of Do Chi Ya Charn, which resulted in the deaths of at least 40 men, women, and children. Unsurprisingly, the government has continued to deny that such massacres have even taken place, despite a UN investigation backed up by eyewitness accounts. Furthermore, over the weekend, the Myanmar government accused the international aid group, Doctors Without Borders, of being biased toward the Rohingya minority and effectively banned the organization. Yet a recent report by Fortify Rights points to a leaked government document exposing the extent of institutionalized human rights restrictions against the Rohingya. The report highlights government restrictions on everything from movement to marriage, childbirth, home repairs, and even the construction of places of worship. Specifically, the leaked documents point to an unpublished policy dating back to 2005, which imposes a strict two-child policy for Rohingya Muslims in specific townships. The efforts to control the population goes as far as requiring Rohingya couples to get legal permission to marry. To make matters worse, Myanmar's national law also denies citizenship to the estimated 1.3 million Rohingya in the country. And left with no rights, of course, leaves these people with no voice. Myanmar's government has enjoyed Western economic aid in exchange for access to its resource-rich lands. And recently, the government assumed the position of chair of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This is why it's more important than ever that the global community and the international media take a stand and pressure the government of Myanmar to stop the persecution and restore the dignity of the Rohingya people.
Yeah, I take no prisoners, you call it aggressive, but all I see is lies coming out in your message.
I often discuss the many dangers associated with hydraulic fracturing or fracking. From artificial earthquakes to sinkholes, there's mounting evidence that proves that the environmental risks posed by fracking far outweigh its net energy benefit. Now, you might also be familiar with the liquid that's used for fracking, a chemical cocktail used to break down rocks to help with the drilling. Well, this same liquid has been found to be associated with a whole host of adverse health effects all across the country. Now, adding to these concerns is the practice of offshore fracking. In the case of California, federal authorities have granted permits to oil rig operators to dump billions of gallons of fracking waste into the Pacific Ocean every year. But this license to pollute isn't sitting too well with environmental activists who have recently filed a legal petition urging the federal government to establish restrictions on this horrible practice. So join me now to break down what the effects of this toxic waste are and what exactly the new petition is calling for. I'm joined by RT correspondent Ramon Galindo. Thanks so much for coming on, Ramon.
Good to be here, Abby.
So first of all, tell me exactly what this fracking waste consists of and how much of it's ending up in the ocean every year.
Sure. Well, one of the big problems, Abby, is that people don't know what is inside of these of this fracking waste. These oil companies aren't supposed, or they haven't been disclosing the type of chemicals in here, and there really hasn't been any sort of long-term study on the negative effects that it's having on the marine life. However, the EPA, they do regulate what is dumped into the water. Technically, offshore oil rigs are not supposed to be dumping anything into the water unless you have a permit. Now, this is a copy of the permit which allows tons of different fluids to be dumped into the ocean. They include domestic and sanitary waste, blowout preventer fluid, and according to the Center for Biological Diversity, there's also fracking waste being dumped into the ocean. So right now what they're trying to do is make sure that these offshore drillers aren't allowed to dump any of this waste, and they're really challenging the EPA to look into these negative effects that they're having on human and animal life.
So you're saying that as it stands right now, the EPA is not really assessed. Well, first of all, we don't really know exactly what's being dumped, and second of all, the EPA has not assessed actually any sort of effects environmentally of the dumping into the ocean, correct?
Right. Well, the reports are that offshore fracking has been going on for decades, but really this disposal has been going on under the radar. It wasn't even really up until the last couple of years that journalists uncovered that this was going on, that environmentalists and regulators have really taken a close look at this. I mean, California regulators were taken aback at the fact that any of this was going on in the very environmentally sensitive Santa Barbara channel there. Now, there are limits to the type of things that are dumped off of these offshore oil rigs. You can't dump oil, you can't dump diesel, and even the fracking fluid that is dumped does have to be treated, and it goes under strict monitoring. If it's under a certain toxicity level, it is allowed, but if it's too toxic, then it does have to be dumped. It is not allowed to be dumped into the ocean.
Well, I'll tell you, Roman, I don't really trust even what they say is, you know, just toxic enough to dump. But I mean, really quickly explain how it works, because I think we know about offshore drilling, I guess, for oil, but I've never even heard of offshore fracking.
Right, it's a relatively new thing. Fracking's been going on for a few decades. This offshore fracking, according to the American Petroleum Institute, started during the 90s, and really it takes a lot more sand. They say that it's better because it uses less water, but at the end of the day, they're dumping a lot of the waste right back into the ocean. So that really brings up a lot of new questions as to what sort of harm is being done, and that's why these environmental groups are really taking a closer look and challenging the EPA to look into these harmful effects.
So right now, just go over this one more time with me. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit confused. So right now, what agreement does the government have with these companies to legally dump this waste in the ocean?
Right now, the EPA, they have these contracts that exempt them from the Safe Drinking Water Act, because the Safe Drinking Water Act, or the Safe Water Act, excuse me, doesn't allow for any dumping. But if you get an exemption, then you get to dump certain fluids that are approved. This fracking waste is one of them, but it does have to meet a certain toxicity level. And they have set this limit according to the analysis from the Center of Biological Diversity that says that they can dump up to 9 billion gallons of this waste every year.
Wonderful. That's extremely comforting. You know, Ramon, I guess the next question is, why dump it in the ocean? I mean, is there really nothing else that can be done with the liquid waste here? Right.
Well, it does seem like a very poor place to put it, but when you think about the alternative, it's equally as dangerous. If it is too toxic to dump into the ocean, then it has to be shipped onshore and put into injection wells. Now, these injection wells are really a source of great controversy because it's been linked to contamination of water systems. A lot of proponents of fracking say that it is a safe practice and that it hasn't been the drilling technique itself hasn't been proven to be dangerous to the environment. However, several studies, including government studies, have proven that these injection wells are very dangerous to water systems.
What a nightmare. Well, you know, you're in LA. The Los Angeles City Council recently voted in favor of a moratorium on fracking. I mean, that's pretty huge. Can you tell us about the circumstances that led up to this vote? And do you think the decision will make a larger impact outside of just LA?
Sure. Well, there were activists that were really celebrating, but at the same time, they're very cautious. What happened last week is that the city council unanimously voted to move forward with a moratorium on fracking here in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is home to the largest urban oil fields in the United States. And so now the city attorney has to come up with an ordinance that would completely prohibit the practice here in Los Angeles. But we have to remember that it doesn't prohibit it in the surrounding communities where fracking still happens. And there are several other counties here in California that still use the practice. In the last year, there was an attempt to completely ban fracking throughout the state of California, but the energy lobby, along with lawmakers here, are still very much in favor of exploiting our oil and gas resources, whether it's on land or whether it's in the water. So they did pass a law which requires oil companies to report where they're drilling and to report some of the chemicals, but it really doesn't go far enough, according to some activists who say that the legislation was watered way down compared to when they wanted to ban fracking completely. And of course, Jerry Brown is very big proponent of fracking. I mean, let's really quickly talk about the petition. What are they hoping to achieve with it, and what are the next steps? We have about a minute left. Sure. Well, under this petition that was filed by the Center of Biological Diversity, they're trying to get the EPA to either amend or completely revoke this contract, which allows these offshore oil rigs, there's 23 of them out there in the Santa Barbara Channel, which are allowed to dump these fluids out into the ocean. So it's up to the EPA. There are provisions in the contract that say that if it is found to be harmful to human or to animal life, that they can revoke these contracts. So they're really challenging the EPA to take a look at it. I called the EPA to get their response and to ask them where they got this number that it's allowable to dump 9 billion gallons of waste into the ocean. I'm still waiting to hear back from them, and the center's still waiting to hear back from them as well. Thank you so much, Ramon Galindo. Appreciate it. You bet. Stick around, you guys. I'll be breaking down Ukraine and Russia's takeover of Crimea next.
Their patients are force-fed.
Explosion near the finish line of the Boston Marathon.
More than 1,000 people have gathered.
What is the latest that you're hearing about the number of victims?
5 seconds. And over the mic is all fuel to go.
Did you know the press is the only industry specifically mentioned in the Constitution?
Stand by.
That's because a free and open press is critical to our democracy.
Track Alpha. Roll Alpha.
In fact, the single biggest threat facing our nation today is the corporate takeover of our government and our press.
Stand by, camera 1. We've
been hijacked by a handful of powerful transnational corporations that will profit by destroying what our founding fathers once built up. I'm Tom Hartman, and on this show, we reveal the big picture of what's actually going on in the world. We go beyond identifying the problem.
We try to fix it.
Rational debate and a real discussion of the critical issues facing America.
Stand by on camera, go.
Ready to join the movement? Then welcome to the big picture.
Over Over the past few days, the Ukrainian crisis has taken on a new face that could snowball into something well beyond the borders of the country. After the Ukrainian parliament unanimously voted to oust President Viktor Yanukovych just over 2 weeks ago, Arseniy Yatsenyuk was appointed acting prime minister until elections are held. And in recent days, Russia moved into the semi-autonomous region of Crimea, an area of land wedged in between Ukraine and Russia. Now, Russia has already had a military presence in Crimea for at least 200 years, but it's been a source of contention since the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. According to U.S. officials, there are now at least 6,000 troops on the ground, and for all intents and purposes, Russia now has complete control of the area. But the U.S. has also had a heavy hand in Ukraine since the dissolution of the Soviet bloc. According to Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nolan, the U.S. government has already invested $5 billion on the ground over the past 2 decades to build up a pro-Western leadership in the country. And after the latest developments, other members of the political establishment are not sitting idly by. Secretary of State John Kerry has already had the audacity to say, you just don't invade another country on phony pretext in order to assert your interests. Well, I can't think of when that's ever happened before. So in order to understand the historical context of what's happening on the ground in Crimea, as well as what's being missed by the corporate media, I was joined earlier by Jeffrey Sommers, Associate Professor of Political Economy at the University of Wisconsin. I started by asking him about how much military influence Russia already had in Crimea.
Russia, of course, has had a presence in the Crimea since Ukraine became independent, and of course far predating that. So for some 300 years, Crimea has been part of Russia. It was only made part of the Soviet Ukraine by Nikita Khrushchev in 1954, and a Russian presence has never left the area.
You've talked repeatedly about NATO expansion in a post-Cold War era in relation to Russia's current interests in Ukraine. How does this play into the latest move into Crimea?
When Gorbachev was presented with the prospect of letting the Warsaw Pact nations go in 1989, he did so, but with some trepidation. Of course, Russia and the Soviet Union had previously been invaded several times, World War II. Of course, there was World War I. There was the Franco-Prussian War, which saw aggressive Germany, which did not invade Russia, nonetheless showed aggressive German tendencies. And given the magnitude of losses in World War II by Russia or the Soviet Union, they had some concern about the resurfacing or reemergence of a Germany that would be powerful and could potentially invade again. So the assurance that they were looking for was that NATO would not expand into the Warsaw Pact nations. In short, what we used to call the Soviet bloc. Now, George Bush, number 41, not his son, number 43, more or less understood that this was important to Russia or the Soviet Union. And they made an agreement, more or less, an informal one, but an important one, to not have NATO go into the Warsaw Pact. And of course, as soon as the Soviet Union dissolved, this was the first thing that NATO did. It went into the Warsaw Pact nations, the former Warsaw Pact nations. And of course, it's entirely understandable why those nations, given a past of Soviet interference, if not occupation, would want NATO membership. But it was also really, I think, incumbent upon the United States just to say no, that we have this deal, we want stability, we don't want Russia to feel as if it is now just to be dominated.
And how much do you think U.S. and EU forces directly played in overthrowing Ukraine's government?
Well, they've been very involved for some time in trying to bring forth a set of political leaders that would be more in concert with their policies. And they're also, of course, active in Belarus, as they have been in Georgia as well. So, yes, they've been very active. And, of course, Vladimir Putin, one can be critical of him, but I think at the same time, one needs to understand that he proposed a kind of tripartite agreement between the EU, the US, and Russia to try and deal with the conditions on the ground in Ukraine as its government was dissolving before us. And he was more or less rejected by the US and the EU, who I think felt that they could just do whatever they wanted, as they've been doing since 1991.
You've been writing extensively about this. The Russian government recently released a statement saying that it doesn't recognize the new leadership, of course, of Ukraine, that it's protecting ethnic Russians in Crimea. What evidence is there that Russians in Crimea are being persecuted?
Well, I think that this is somewhat of a pretext on the part of Russia. I mean, But, you know, if it ever did reach the point where Russian speakers, if not ethnic Russians, were actually being persecuted, then, of course, we might see some intervention that would be more legitimate. I think this was really, to be frank, to be more candid, it was about Russia taking a stand regarding a further NATO intervention into areas which it formerly controlled and which, again, are comprised of predominantly Russian-speaking peoples. So, in other words, it wasn't going to continue to be encircled, and it wasn't going to be according to, and it was Zbigniew Brzezinski in his Grand Chessboard book, a continuation of a model which sought to just keep busting up Russia, to keep hacking away at it. So, you know, I guess what I would say is that in sum, you know, this is not an Anschluss. This is not a, you know, Hungary 1956 or Czechoslovakia 1968 situation. I mean, these are places where Russia has its people, and it's, you know, just not going to tolerate NATO's further move into what were territories that it historically held to be its own.
Sure, I just can't help but wonder what the motive is. I mean, in the grand scheme, considering how Russia knows how the West is going to react to something like this. I mean, look at the media; it's just completely insane. Jeffrey, in 1994, an agreement with Ukraine called the Budapest Memorandum was signed. U.S., U.K., Russia, and Ukraine to respect the sovereignty of the country in exchange for giving up its nuclear weapons. What is Russia's rationale for not holding up that agreement?
Well, again, just for all of the reasons that I've just stated, that if this is going to be just used as a pretext, I mean, in other words, Russia was willing to let Ukraine exist as it was constructed as a Soviet republic. And let's, you know, make no mistake about it, it was a construction of the Soviet Union. So you had Joseph Stalin in 1939, who adds Galicia, which essentially, you know, was part of Poland, and that's where some of the more ultra-nationalistic elements are coming from in this protest, you know, from the populations that Stalin tacked on in 1939. That's not all of them now. I don't want to suggest that that's the only source of them, but the most extreme elements are certainly from there. 1922, you know, Lenin adds a good bit of territory to eastern Ukraine that is predominantly Russian-speaking, and then, of course, Crimea gets added in 1954. So, you know, what we saw with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and then again this pact in 1994, was more or less Russia's agreement that it would respect the territorial integrity of that Soviet Ukrainian republic that it in fact created.
Considering Russia's strong backing of diplomacy in stopping the proliferation of nuclear weapons in Iran, procuring chemical weapons in Syria, I mean, do you think it's at all hypocritical that the country decided to completely bypass diplomatic measures when it comes to Ukraine?
Yes, maybe to a certain extent. And in fact, you know, I really actually had some hopes that the U.S. and Russia were kind of reaching a new accord. Now, of course, I'm not referring to these Eurasianists in the State Department, people like Victoria Nuland and others who are hardcore right-wing figures that just want to bust up Russia. But it seemed as though maybe Barack Obama, Joe Biden, John Kerry were seeing that there were some benefits to working with Russia. We saw that in Syria. And that perhaps we were moving towards a new direction, one in which there might be a better cooperation between them. I think this all got blown apart by the actions, in part, of the State Department and those elements that were fostering these protests in Ukraine. And again, I don't think those protests are entirely illegitimate. I mean, the Ukrainian people have been abused by kleptocrats from the start, from 1991, and I certainly understand their desire to have better government. But the direction that this new government was moving in terms of having some rather unsavory ultra-nationalist elements, not that that was all of the protesters, but that, again, combined with the prospects of NATO coming in, led to the Russians acting very, very quickly. I think they saw themselves as very quickly losing control of the situation and potentially seeing in the future a NATO in Crimea. I mean, you know, absolutely intolerable.
Well, we've seen how that's played out in other areas. You know, what do you see as the best case scenario to come out of Crimea, Russia, Western powers, and most importantly, Ukrainians out of the situation?
Well, the best case scenario would be if this actually forced a new set of negotiations between the EU, the United States, and Russia, ones which would be held in secret, frankly, so that public opinion didn't intrude too much, and by public opinion I mean the interests of the very, very powerful, and frank discussions taking place regarding security, regarding economic cooperation, and reverting back to, again, that original agreement that Bush number 41 and Gorbachev had regarding NATO, and to halt its further expansion. I think the United States needs to make a firm commitment that it's not going to tolerate NATO to expand any further. And I think if this was done, we could then perhaps see Russia pull back, and we could see perhaps a new environment in which more productive talks among the big three players took place.
And of course, Jeffrey, the mainstream media is going crazy right now. I mean, threats of sanctions, diplomatic isolation. I mean, serious stuff here, reminiscent of a Cold War revival. I mean, do you think that if those exaggerated, rather, and if they weren't put in place? Let me rephrase that. Okay, let's talk about the mainstream media. I mean, they're threatening sanctions, of course, diplomatic isolation on part of the U.S. I mean, how serious are these threats? And if they are done, I mean, would that effectively put us back in a Cold War era mindset?
Well, yes and no. Now, I don't think the sanctions would be very serious, and we already see the Germans trying to mute these kinds of discussions. They understand that they're absolutely dependent on Russian gas, and they don't want this situation spiraling out of control. Many Russians, of course, hold U.S. dollars, and so they're not altogether unhappy when the value of the dollar rises. So, that's not so much of an issue, especially for Russia's wealthier people. What I do think, though, is rather disconcerting from my perspective as an American is I think that discussions regarding the military industrial complex here and its downsizing are potentially going to be reversed as a consequence of this.
That was Jeffrey Summers, Associate Professor of Political Economy at the University of Wisconsin. Before we wrap up the show, I wanted to say something from my heart about the ongoing political crisis in Ukraine and Russia's military occupation of Crimea. Just because I work here for RT doesn't mean I don't have editorial independence. And I can't stress enough how strongly I am against any state intervention in a sovereign nation's affairs. What Russia did is wrong. I admittedly don't know as much as I should about Ukraine's history or the cultural dynamics of the region, but what I do know is that military intervention is never the answer. And I will not sit here and apologize or defend military aggression. Furthermore, the coverage I've seen of Ukraine has been truly disappointing from all sides of the media spectrum and rife with disinformation. Above all, my heart goes out to the Ukrainian people who are now wedged as pawns in the middle of a global power chess game. They're the real losers here. All we can do now is hope for a peaceful outcome for a terrible situation and prevent another full-blown Cold War between multiple superpowers. Until then, I'll keep telling the truth as I see it. Have a good night, everyone. I'll see you back here to break the set tomorrow.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire and tone. These words are hard hitting, you watching your neck, but you need to tune in, cause we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
Sorry about the audio difficulties, guys. Let's try this again. Amidst the many international political crises that have gripped the media attention over the last few years, perhaps one of the most overlooked and underreported mass injustices is the oppression of the Rohingya people of Myanmar. See, according to the UN, Rohingya Muslims are among the most persecuted minorities in the world. Although Muslims have lived in Myanmar since the 15th century, the country is predominantly Buddhist, with Rohingya Muslims making up only between 4 to 8% of the population. But ever since a 1962 military coup, the rights of the Rohingya people have slowly deteriorated. The Rohingya minority and effectively banned the organization. Yet a recent report by Fortify Rights points to a leaked government document exposing the extent of institutionalized human rights restrictions against the Rohingya. The report highlights government restrictions on everything from movement to marriage, childbirth, home repairs, and even the construction of places of worship. Specifically, the leaked documents point to an unpublished policy dating back to 2005, which imposes a strict two-child policy for Rohingya Muslims in specific townships. The efforts to control the population goes as far as requiring Rohingya couples to get legal permission to marry. To make matters worse, Myanmar's national law also denies citizenship to the estimated 1.3 million Rohingya in the country. And left with no rights, of course, leaves these people with no voice. Myanmar's government has enjoyed Western economic aid in exchange for access to its resource-rich lands. And recently, the government assumed the position of chair of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This is why it's more important than ever that the global community and the international media take a stand and pressure the government of Myanmar to stop the persecution and restore the dignity of the Rohingya people.
Yeah, I take no prisoners, you call it aggressive, but all I see is lies coming out in your message. What can you say?
I often discuss the many dangers associated with hydraulic fracturing or fracking. From artificial earthquakes to sinkholes, there's mounting evidence that proves that the environmental risks posed by fracking far outweigh its net energy benefit. Now, you might also be familiar with the liquid that's used for fracking, a chemical cocktail used to break down rocks to help with the drilling. Well, this same liquid has been
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait, do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
And for the last 50 years, they've been the target of an oppressive state campaign of isolation and oppression. All the while, the crisis incurs a total blackout from the Myanmar government and world media at large. Now, you probably wouldn't associate Buddhist monks with violence, but religious tensions between Rakhine Buddhists and Rohingya Muslims in recent years has escalated into a full-blown violent persecution of the latter. And since 2012, violent outbreaks have left hundreds dead and somewhere around 140,000 displaced. And on January 13th of this year, yet another massacre occurred in the township of Do Chi Ya Charn, which resulted in the deaths of at least 40 men, women, and children. Unsurprisingly, the government has continued to deny that such massacres have even taken place, despite a UN investigation backed up by eyewitness accounts. Furthermore, over the weekend, the Myanmar government accused the international aid group, Doctors Without Borders, of being biased toward